Okay, hello seventh period. This is the second segment of your reading homework that is due this Friday. So we're starting on page 51. So we're starting on page 51. Just a reminder, if you need a reminder on the annotation format, please look at the reading guide sheet I gave you. Okay, page 51. The men in the column were slapping their hands together and stamping their feet. The wind was brutal. It looked like the guards were already up on all six watchtowers, but the men were still not being let inside. They must have another security drive on. Here it was. The officer in charge of the escort came out of the guardroom with an inspector. They stood on each side of the gate and opened it. Line up by fives. 1, 2. The prisoners marched as though they were on a parade, almost like soldiers. Once they got into the compound, they knew what to do without being told. Just past the guard's room was the work office. The work supervisor was standing there, calling over the gang bosses, and one of the foremen, a man called Durr, went over to them. A real bastard. He was like a prisoner himself, but he treated everyone else like dirt. It was 8 o'clock, maybe 5 minutes past. The steam engine they used to generate power had just given a blast on its whistle. The fellows in charge were scared stiff about the prisoners wasting time and ducking into shelters to keep warm. But the prisoners had a long day and took their time. As soon as they got into the compound, they started bending down to pick up pieces of wood. It all came in handy for the stove back in the camp. Tyrion told his assistant Pablo to come to the office with him. Caesar went along too. Caesar was rich, got 2 packages from home every month, and bribed all the right people. He had a soft job in the office, helping the fellow in charge of the worksheets. The rest of Gang 104 took off like greased lightning. The sun came up red and hazy over the empty compound. There were panels for prefabs covered over with snow, and the beginning of a brick wall they had stopped worked on. Then there was a broken part of a bulldozer, and a scoop and some metal scrap. There were ditches, trenches, and holes all over the place. The vehicle repair shops were finished except for the roofs, and on a rise there was a power plant where they had started on the second story. Everyone was out of sight, all but the 6th sentry standing on the watchtowers and the men bustling around the office. This was the best moment in the day for a prisoner. They said the chief supervisor had threatened no end of times to pass out the work orders the evening before, but it never really worked because they'd always changed their minds by morning. But as it was, they now had a moment to change to themselves. While they were figuring things out, you could find some warm spot and stay there for a spell before you started breaking your back. It was good if you get near the stove to take your foot clothes off, warm them a little, and then put them on again. Then your feet would be warm all day long, but even if you couldn't get to a stove, it was still great. Gang 104 went to the repair shops where they'd put window panes in last autumn, and Gang 38 was making concrete blocks. Some of these blocks were lying around in their molds, others were standing upright, and there was steel meshwork for reinforcing the concrete. There was a high roof and an earthen floor, and it never really got warm here, but it was heated, and they weren't stingy with the coals, not so people could get warm, but so the blocks would set better. There was even a thermometer, and on Sundays, if the prisoners weren't working, they had a free worker in there to keep the fire going. Of course, the men of Gang 38 were hogging the stove, drying out their footcloths. Okay, so the rest of us have to sit in a corner. What the hell? Shukov perched on the edge of a wooden mold with his back to the wall. The seat of his padded pants had seen worse. When he leaned back, his coat and jacket pulled tight around his body, and on the left side of his chest by his heart he felt something hard. This was the hunk of bread in his inside pocket, the half of his morning ration he'd saved for the meal break. He'd always brought this much with him, to work and never touch it before the meal break. He always ate the other half at breakfast, but today he hadn't. He now saw it wasn't a saving at all. He had felt a great hunger pang and wanted to eat it right away in this warm place. There were 5 hours to the meal break. It was a long time. The pain in his back had now shifted to his legs, and they had felt all weak. If only he could get near the stove. He put his mittens on his knees, undid his coat, untied the frozen face rag from his neck, broke the ice to fold it up, and put it in his pocket. Then he took the bread and a piece of white cloth and cradled it behind the flap of his coat, not to lose a single crumb, starting gradually nibbling at it and chewing it. He had carried the bread under 2 layers of clothes and warmed it with his own body, so it wasn't frozen at all. In the camps, he often remembered how they used to eat at home in the village, potatoes by the panful and pots of kasha, and in the early years before that, great hunks of meat, and they swilled enough milk to make their bellies burst. But he understood in the camps this was all wrong. You had to eat with all your thoughts in the food, like he was nibbling off these little bits now, and turn them over on your tongue and rolled them into your mouth, and then it tasted so good, the soggy black bread. What had he eaten this 8 years and more? Nothing at all, for the work he'd done on it. He was busy with his 6 ounces of bread, while his whole gang sat there on the same side of the shed. Two Estonians, who were like brothers, were sitting on a low concrete block and smoking half a cigarette in turns from the same holder. They were both very fair, tall, and thin. Both had long noses and big eyes. They stuck together as though they couldn't breathe without each other. The gang boss never separated them. They shared all their food and slept on the top level of the same bunk. And in the column were at a roll call or going to bed at night, they were always talking to each other in slow, quiet voices. But they weren't brothers at all. They'd only gotten to know each other here in the gang. One of them, they said, had been a fisherman. The other had been taken to Sweden by his parents when the Soviets came to Estonia, and he was still a kid. But after he grew up, he came back to Estonia of his own accord to get a college education. Nowadays, people say it doesn't matter where you come from and that there are bad people everywhere. But of all the Estonians he had seen, Shukov had never come across a bad one. They were still sitting either on the slabs or on the molds or just on the ground. You didn't feel like talking in the morning, and they were all wrapped up in their own thoughts. That scavenger, Fetikov, had scrounged together quite a pile of cigarette butts from somewhere. He would even pick them out of a spittoon without batting an eye, and now he was sorting them on his knees and putting all the unburned tobacco in a piece of paper. Fetikov had 3 children outside, but they'd all disowned him when he was arrested, and his wife had married again, so there was no one to send him things. The captain looking at Fetikov out of the corner of his eye, and then he yelled, "Hey, what are you collecting all that crap for? You'll get syphilis. Throw it out." The captain was used to giving orders, and he always talked to people like that. But Fetikov didn't have to take orders from the captain. He didn't get any packages either, so he just leered at him in a nasty way. He'd lost some of his teeth and said, "Just wait, Captain, till you've been here 8 years. You'll be doing the same thing. It's happened to better men than you." Fetikov was judging by himself, but maybe the captain wouldn't go down so quickly. What's that? Senka Klevshkin said. He was rather deaf and couldn't hear what they were saying. He thought they were talking about the captain's trouble at roll call. "You shouldn't have yelled at them like that," he shook his head sadly. "It would have blown over." Senka Klevshkin was a quiet fellow, and he had had a very hard life. One of his eardrums had burst back in 41. Then he'd taken prisoner, but he got away. They caught him and stuck him in Buchenwald. And Buchenwald, he stayed alive by a miracle, and now he was here quietly doing his sentence. He said if you kicked up a fuss, you were finished. The only thing for you was to put your back into the work. That was for sure. If you tried to fight them, they'd break your neck. Alushka dropped his face into his hands. He was praying. Shukov ate his ration nearly to the end, but he saved a bare crust, a round piece from the top, because you couldn't eat out of the mush in your bowl with a spoon like you could with bread. He wrapped up the crust again in the white cloth for the next meal, stuck the cloth in the pocket on the inside of his jacket, buttoned himself up against the cold, and got ready. Let them send him to work now if they wanted, but he'd like it better if they waited a while. Gang 38 got up. Some of them went to the cement mixer, some to get water, some to the steel meshwork. But neither Tira nor Pavel had come back to the gang, and though they'd been sitting down for barely 20 minutes and the workday, a short winter one, went on only until 6, they all thought this had been wonderful luck, and the evening didn't seem far now. "You know, there hasn't been a blizzard for a long time," said Latvian Kilgas with a sigh. He had red cheeks and was well fed. "Not one storm all winter. What kind of winter is that?" "Yes, not a single blizzard, not a single blizzard." A sigh went to the gang. When there was a snowstorm in these parts, they didn't dare you take it out of the barracks, let alone to work. Without a rope slung between your barracks and the mess hall, you could get lost. If a prisoner froze to death in the snow, the dogs could eat him for all anybody cared, but what if he escaped? It happened sometimes. When there was a storm, the snow was very, very fine, but in the snowdrifts, it got packed down. Prisoners had gotten over the wire across these snowdrifts and made a run for it. But it's true, they didn't get far. Come to think of it, snowstorms weren't much use. They kept the prisoners locked in. The coal was late coming in and the warmth was blown out of the barracks. They brought no flour into the camp, and there was no bread, and things got fouled up in the mess hall. And it didn't matter how long the blizzard lasted, a couple of days or a week. They counted the days they lost as days off, and the men were marched out to work for the same number of Sundays in a row. All the same, the men loved storms and prayed for them. Anytime there was a low wind, everyone stared at the sky. Give us some of the real stuff. All right, guys, that's the second segment of your reading homework. That's the second segment of your reading homework. I would go ahead right now, do your sticky note annotation for a passage. And again, if you need the format, go ahead and look at the reading guide notes. God bless you and have a good evening.